give you a little roadmap here today of where we're headed. So I'm going to start a little bit about my background, where I'm coming from, and today is all about leveraging the tension between mechanics and narrative. And oftentimes, as a conversation among designers, is what takes precedence, because inevitably, at some point, your narrative and your mechanic is going to conflict. Some designers will kind of just give a green flag to their mechanic and say the mechanic overrides the narrative. Other designers will say that the narrative is more important, and when those start running each other over, I think we lose a lot. I think there's a potential not only to resolve that conflict, but actually use that tension to improve player experience. So that's where we're going to go. So we've got mechanics, we're going to talk about narrative. The game I'm working on currently is a 6-player, semi-cooperative board game called Halls of Asgard, and a Viking theme. It's a lot of fun. I'll tell you a bit about that and how we use this principle of leveraging that tension in the game to improve it as we work through prototype after prototype after prototype. So, any questions? Let's do it. Okay. One thing I'm hoping to do today is do some kind of little pod discussions. Since we're such a small group, we'll probably just have that as a whole group discussion. If a few more people pop in, I might break you guys up into groups of 2 or 3, and then we can reflect a little bit, we'll talk a little bit. Whenever you see this symbol, keep an eye out. That means we're going to have a quick little pod discussion. So my background in game design starts kind of with my childhood. I was very invested in stories. My dad is a professor of English literature at the University of Alberta here. My grandfather was a high school English teacher, and so I was just raised with stories all around. Being a good son, of course, of a English lit professor, I went the exact opposite direction, and I did my degree in math and computer theory. So my dad, to this day, still thinks I may be adopted, but that's kind of where I took my university degree. Focused on several things. There was some chemistry, some science, but also studied game theory and the theory of computers, basically what computers can do. Not so much the coding and the programming, but the theory of what a computer is capable of. So, led me to a career in teaching high school. I currently teach computer science and game design at a high school at Spruce. So I started Littlehammer Games in late 2017. We're a team of 5 people, all with sort of specific disciplines. I'm a design lead, so I kind of go around and just orchestrate different jobs. We have different people who have different specialties: marketing, layout editing, the mythology. One guy is kind of focused just on mythology, and we all kind of work together to create the game and run playtests. So that's where I'm coming from. And the first thing I want to open up today with is why board games. And I know DBX is a digital and analog sort of combination conference, and I love video games. I've always loved playing them as I grew up. I teach some video game design at high school, but I think board games have a really important place in our society today. As a high school teacher, I see a lot of kids, hundreds of kids, every year kind of come through my doors, come through my classroom, and I'm not going to lie, I'm concerned. I don't want to kind of be a negative Nelly or anything about high school kids. I meet a lot of amazing kids. What I'm more concerned about is the challenges they're facing and how I feel perhaps they're maybe unprepared. We are at a stage in society where technology is just, it's ubiquitous. I mean, it's almost to the point where I had a conversation with a parent the other day, and they said they were concerned that their kid was going online too much. And I looked at the parent and I said, you got to understand, you go online. Kids don't go online. They are online all the time. They are on their smartphones, they're on their cell. There's not a single minute of the day that they are not, on an internet-connected device that is on a person. And so we got to change our mindset when we talk about kids and technology. And I think technology has obviously a lot of promise. It improves our lives in so many ways. But I do think we need to shift our thinking and maybe culturally make a shift to help kids and to help even perhaps ourselves deal with this shift. The one thing that always gets harped on with technology is the social interaction, right? I do see an increasing number of kids who have a really hard time with the social interaction aspect of things. And one of the reasons I love board games is because I think board games are a fantastic way to provide kind of a social structure that is set for people to set into and step into and interact with. You put a bunch of strangers into a room and just tell them to talk, you're going to get crickets, right? Oftentimes, maybe there's one person who's really talkative, who'll get up there. You take a room of strangers, put them in a room with a board game, and when there's that set sort of kind of social structure, there's some norms already set out. I think that's a good sort of introduction, way to kind of get them comfortable in the social space, and perhaps that'll lead to some more organic interactions later. Another reason I say this is I do see kids coming from all over the world. We have cultures, some students, their first language is not English, some students were not born in Canada, and when we're all kind of thrown into one space, our cultural norms might not be the same. Our language might not be the same, our customs might not be the same. I think board games are a really neat way to bring people from different cultures into the same space, kind of create a kind of a false set of sort of rules that we can all kind of abide by and understand, and have that sort of kickstart the conversation. So that's one of the reasons why I want to focus on board games, and why I think board game design is important. I think we've got a lot to give to society, especially where we're at currently today. When I talk with game designers, sometimes some people think the rule books are the most important thing. You have to have a really well laid out rule book. Everything has to be defined. Everything has to be clear. Other people, when they're designing games, think like the appearance. Like they want people to pick their game up off the shelf. It's got a beautiful art, and I'm not going to argue it's not important. But I think the main component, the most essential component of any game of any type, that often gets forgotten about by designers, is the players themselves. Players don't come in the box. The players don't come off the shelf, but if you have no players, you have no game. And I think you can think of the players as a, for some reason my picture didn't show up here, that's okay. I think you can think of the players, and I don't mean to sound crass like this, I think you can think of them as a component of your actual game. If you take a look at dice, and Halls of Asgard does employ dice as a way of sort of creating chance and those sorts of things. This dice has specific properties, right? It's a physical thing. It does certain things. There's certain things you can do with it. Game designers have been incredibly creative with what you can actually do with dice. I want to say everything that can be done with dice has been done, but that's probably not true. Thinking about your human players who are actually playing your game in the same way, I think can be a real advantage to designers. Now, not all humans are the same. Humans are dynamic, they're different personalities, but there are also certain things you can say about people. If you study psychology, there are certain general principles and rules, and that is actually going to have a huge impact on your game. So, throughout the conversation today, I really want to focus on creating a game for the players. It's kind of pulling in the threads of everything you guys said. When you're creating a game, it's not something that sits in a box. The game itself is what happens when people step in and start playing it. It's a structure, it's maybe a set of rules or a set of customs that allow that sort of interaction, but the players are the focus. They're the most powerful, dynamic things that are going to be a part of your game, and they are actually a part of your game. Okay. So that's my approach when it comes to game design. We're going to talk a little bit about mechanics, about narrative, and then we'll talk about trying to mesh them together. Okay. So in terms of mechanics, there was a French theorist, Kaiwa, and he broke up all sorts of games. He studied games earlier in the century. He broke up all sorts of games into kind of 4 types. And he's a hoity-toity French guy, so he wanted to use some fancy Greek names. And so, actually, I think these are Greek. I'm not Latin, but these were kind of the 4. So Agon was the first one. Agon was games that involve competition. Okay, so think like chess. Classic Agon strategy game. It also includes sports. So soccer is kind of a representation of here. There's kind of at least 2 parties. They're competing to sort of do a certain, achieve a goal, defeat the other team, score points. This is one classification of kind of game type mechanic. The second one, Aliyah, you see the dice there, is about chance. And if you think about gambling is play poker, blackjack, those sorts of things. There's a bit of strategy, but a lot of it has to do with chance. And dealing with chance, sometimes it involves betting with money and stuff. This is a main mechanic for many games as well. The third one there, Gavin Argyle's sweater there, mimicry. And mimicry is a term that we may have familiarity already. To mimic someone means to imitate. And so mimicry is a game based on role playing. And taking the part of a certain character or pretending you are in a different universe. The last but not least, the guy with the parachute, Alex, is thrill-based. And so think about roller coasters. Okay, roller coasters are fun, or be considered a game by Kaiwa because they're the point of it is kind of get that adrenaline rush. And so he broke down games into these 4 categories, and I think these can be really helpful as a designer when you're thinking about designing a game, or as you're in the process of designing, really focusing on what's the main focus of my game. And I would say most games have at least 2 of these as kind of main components. And I can say that for Halls of Asgard. I can say that for, I'd say, 90% of the games I've played. Some games you can kind of pigeonhole just into one. So, for example, I would say in chess, that is extremely cornered in the Aegon corner. That is just competition. There's not really a narrative. I mean, we call them knights and bishops and queens, but that's not really a focus of the game. It doesn't affect the gameplay. It's just sort of names for the characters. There's not a lot of mimicry unless you really play up the whole, oh, I'm the king or I'm the queen. And there's thrill in terms of making a good move, but that's not really the point of the game. The point of the game is the strategy. And so we'll talk about these 4 categories and how different games fit into these categories later, but I think this is a nice framework for talking about mechanics. Having a shared common framework, I think, in this conversation will be helpful, so we kind of have some similar language. So that's one theorist I'd like to take a look at. Is there any questions about those 4 different categories? Is there any game you maybe, I'm not sure where it would fit, we could maybe plug into a category or 2?
Zombicide.
Zombicide. Give me a quick description of Zombicide.
Zombicide, it's a cooperative game. Your characters are working to kill zombies.
Great.
And not get eaten.
And not get eaten by them. Great. So Zombicide, you guys are doing a little bit of role playing, so we got a little bit of the mimicry. Are the zombies, is it a very strategic game, or the zombies are you dealing with a lot of random events all the time?
Combination. You use your abilities strategically, but the zombies that show up can turn up. What shows up is randomly. Once they show up, they act in a particular.
Great. So I would say the 2 primary drivers there are mimicry and Aaliyah. Then there's some chance, kind of the scariness of zombies. There's some mimicry in terms of role-playing these zombie survivors. There are elements of thrill and competition, but those are sort of secondary, it sounds like, to the main game. So that's a great example of a game we can break down that way. Anybody else want to throw a game out there to break down? We'll do a few together later, so that's fine. The second theorist I want to take a look at, there's only 2 I promised here, is Miguel Siekarts. He works out of Denmark. He's a game theorist. He studies game theory and he teaches in the computer science program there. And he breaks down into what we call agents and interactions. You can think of these as nouns and verbs. And when you're analyzing the mechanics of your own game, this can be a really helpful method in terms of really identifying what's going on. So agents don't have to be players specifically, but they are any things in the game they're able to enact actions or affect the state of the game or what's going on. Interactions are the means by which those agents actually do that. So I'm just going to come back to chess because it's a very general example. 2 of the agents in chess are the players. There are another set of agents which are all the pieces, and the players have certain interactions. They're able to move and control the pieces. And the pieces have certain interactions. They can move in specific ways, and they can destroy or knock out the other components, the other pieces from the other player's table. So agents and interactions. And this is a nice way to make a list of both, kind of breaking down your games in terms of mechanics. So we're going to do this quickly, so we have a little bit of practice. I've got a few examples up there. I already talked a bit about chess. I do some video games in here because DPX is sort of video games and analog games as well. So I'd like you guys to pick one of those games up there. Let's maybe not do chess. Let's do one of the other ones. Let's pick 2 categories that we think that game fits into from Kawa's theories, and then we'll make a quick just list. You can write it down or just verbally talk about it, of agents and interactions in the game. Great. So yeah, I think this is a great framework for thinking about mechanics in games. And when your mechanics and your narrative collide, which they will if you are designing a game, having a sense of kind of where your mechanics are coming from and what the point of your game is may help you resolve some of those conflicts. So that's our stuff on mechanics. We're going to talk a little bit about narrative now. And coming from kind of an RPG background, perhaps this is kind of more, you're going to talk about emergent and progress. We'll talk about some of that as well too. Narrative is so important. And I got to be honest with you, I don't know why board game designers in particular, I want to say 3 out of 5 board game designers that I meet are computer scientists. which makes sense. Computer scientists are dealing with large programs. There's a lot of logical thinking. They love systems. But I do feel that sometimes, especially those with a computer science background, and that's what I have, so I have to be careful of this, get a little bit too caught up with the mechanics and forget about the narrative. And you've got to remember the most important component of our games is our players. Players are people, and people thrive off of stories. I know as a teacher, if you can loop kind of what you're teaching into the narrative of your students' own lives, if you can make it matter to them, if they can see that concept in sort of the context of their life, it's so much more important to them than just a random fact that doesn't fit anywhere. And so we got to make sure that our mechanics are not random sort of things that are floating around in space. We need to fix them in place and sort of give them life, give them a little bit of energy using the narrative. So we'll talk a little bit about narrative, and we'll talk about how to put them together. You guys may have heard of a theorist called Johann Huizinga. If you are into game studies, if you haven't, he is a theorist once again earlier in the century around Kaiwa. And he came up with this concept called the magic circle. And the magic circle is based off this idea of in the olden days, right? People would work all day, and at night they would gather around the fire. There would be kind of this ring of light around the fire, and as people stepped into that ring of light, they kind of enter another sort of world or dimension. As people told stories around the fire, people would believe things that wouldn't be possible in real life. So dragons could exist, and people could use magic and things like that. And he said this is very important when we're playing games. When we're playing games, there has to be some sort of like line that we cross over. So in board games, typically, when you cross that threshold, it's sitting down at the table and laying out the pieces. And as we read the rules, people start to let go of kind of what's possible in the real world, and they start to embrace what's possible in this new sort of imaginary world that we're playing in. So this is important, and once again, my specialty is more in board games, but in video games as well, written advantage, because as soon as somebody sits down to play a game, when they turn on their console, they themselves are starting to step into that magic circle, right? They're preparing themselves to be able to, blast zombies with big guns that they wouldn't be able to do in real life. They're preparing to, be able to use magic and throw fireballs as part of the game. So when you're talking about narrative, it's not just a bunch of mechanics floating in space. We need to bring people into this magic circle as we put our mechanics together and get them believing whatever the narrative of our story is. So that's Huizinga. Kiljonen is she actually works for museums and public sort of education institutions in Sweden. And her name is Johanna Kiljonen here. She took the concept of the magic circle and sort of took it a step further. And I think as board game designers and video game designers, this is a really important extension of the magic circle. The magic circle itself is very basic. Her concept goes a little bit farther. She talks about the participant's journey, which is a bit of play on words for the hero's journey. You've heard of the hero's journey and narrative and stuff like that. But this is what she says. It's not just about the magic circle. The participant, as they enter some sort of museum experience, or we could think of a game experience, they have expectations. They hear about the game from somebody else. They see some advertisements. As they approach that magic circle, they're building their kind of expectations. Those are filtered through two things. One thing is their culture. And so if their culture, if this is relevant to them, I know with Halls of Asgard, it's a Viking themed game that gets some people very, very excited as Vikings. So as part of their expectation stage here, they get very excited. Then they have their actual experience, right? Where are they experiencing this game? It's not just that it's a magic circle. Are they playing this game at home on their computer? Are they playing it out at a board game cafe? Are they playing it at a birthday party? Are they playing it at a really terrible family reunion? All of those things go into their overall experience. They enter the magic circle, they experience sort of what happens, the rules you set up, the mechanics, and then they pass through. We're not finished yet. Before stop, immediately after, they reflect on what they experienced. Did they like it? Did they have a good time? Was somebody being a jerk? Was the drink they were having terrible? Or, was it really great food? All that stuff plays into their experience, and then it gets stored finally as memory. And this is really important as game designers, because we want people to play our games more than once. And so if we are designing games that are going to be taken off the shelf, that are going to be played, that are going to be loved. We talked about Tetris, right? Tetris is such a timeless game. And why is that? You know, it has to do with the fact that as people pass through this participant's journey, once they're here, it gets locked in their memory as a positive thing. They want to go back. They want to play it. If we're not designing with this in mind, we may be really shooting ourselves in the foot. We can have the best game possible, but if it is not filtered through the culture, and if their experience isn't great, we may have a hard time. I see this a lot with playing other people's prototypes. I've seen some amazing games here in Edmonton, but oftentimes the game itself, the concept is awesome. The way it's presented, though, is not great. And if you're, maybe it's disorganized, maybe it's the game designer is not super personable or is being a little bit sort of irritable and things like that, that can affect their experience. It has nothing to do with the game. Well, actually, it does have something to do with the game. It doesn't have anything to do with the Magic Circle experience, but it does have to do with the participant's experience. And once again, the players are the most important component of your game. So when you're designing your game, think about this full journey here. Last thing we're going to talk about before our next little pod chat here is progressive versus emergent stories. And Kim had already mentioned a little bit about emergent details of stories that start to kind of come out as players play. But let me give you a real simple breakdown. Let's talk about books. I'm a very slow reader. I don't read a lot of books because I'm a very slow reader. I'm always working through one, but it takes me 2 or 3 months to get through one. My wife goes to the library every 2 weeks, stack about this big, and she's through it in a week. So she has a lot more reading speed than I do, but we both love books. When you read a novel, and this just blows my mind, you pick up this thing, right? You open it up, there's symbols on a page. We're able to interpret that because we can read the language. That is the progressive story. That's what the author has written. What you are reading, those words, if you're saying them out loud or in your head, that is exactly what the author meant for you to see and to hear. That is not really where the story happens, though. Right? Where does the story happen? In your mind. And your mind is able to fill in so many details that the author themselves don't actually explicitly state. The real exciting things happen here. Okay. It's your interpretation of what's on the page. It's your sort of coloring in and filling out of the words that you're reading. That is what makes the story interesting. And that's what makes the story amazing. Oftentimes, have you guys ever had the experience of going to a film that was based on a book that you liked? And you go to the film and you just hate it because what you imagined in your mind was so much more awesome than they were able to put up on a TV screen. I think this is often why people don't like books, movies that are based on books, because of this exactly. So when we think about our board games, some people get so excited about their world and their game, and it's going to be so awesome. They're going to explain every detail. Their rule book is going to be 64 pages long, right? And that's not always the best approach to take with narrative, right? With narrative, you want to give the players a really fundamental, solid base to allow them to kind of fill in the details themselves. And if you are too specific, if your mechanics weigh the game down and your mechanics just control every single aspect of the game, you are not going to be able to capitalize on this. This is really important in terms of getting players excited about the game. So we'll talk a little bit about how to get this working. So one is, if you're designing a game and you have some mechanics, I'm going to give some examples here in Halls of Asgard later. One is terminology. If players are using the terminology you've come up with for your game, that is a good sign that there's some emergent sort of like properties happening. People are really starting to internalize the story and imagine what's going on. If they are taking a look at your tokens and they're not calling them treasure, they're just calling them token things, they're probably not at that emergent stage, right? They're probably still here, right? They're just pieces on the board, right? If they are playing your video game, they're calling it like the shooty beam, and it's supposed to be like the phase-on laser or something like that. The more they use your terminology, the more you know that they are getting to that stage, and it's a good litmus test for whether they're really invested in that. Watch that in your playtest. If you're playtesting a game, are people using your language? And if they're not, what are they using and what are they, look at what they are using, look at what they're not using, and see how you can better explain or better get people into using the language. So, the next pod chat we're going to talk about here is exactly this. I'd like you guys to reflect on the time that you were playing a game and you really got into the experience. What was a game that kind of like went beyond just the basic game for you? I want to go to a game you may or may not have played called The Resistance. Has anybody here played The Resistance? Okay, so really basic concept, probably the simplest game I've ever played. There's 5 people sitting around a table. One of them is sort of like a bad agent, and 4 of them are good agents, but we don't know who the rat is. And we go on these missions, and people basically just vote yes or no for does the mission pass or fail. And you have to figure out through 5 rounds who the rat is. And if the rat is able to cause the majority of the missions to fail, the rat wins. And if the kind of the good players are able to figure it out, they win. Simplest mechanic ever. And the story itself was almost non-existent. It's within a realm that's kind of sci-fi, and there's all these things going on, but we filled in the details. And we started giving personalities to different people. The one guy was really sneaky, and so he became kind of this greasy guy that nobody really wanted to deal with. This other girl was very soft-spoken and sweet. We found out at the end that she was actually really manipulating everybody else and then screwing them over. So we really embraced kind of the emergent property of that game, even though the designer itself did not give us this, novel to read beforehand to fill out the story. We kind of created this universe ourselves. So in your pods there, let's talk about quickly, what was a game that was pretty simple on the surface, but you were able to kind of experience that sort of emergent level of play? Yeah, fair enough. And as a person who, I'm getting into role-playing, I'm trying out D&D, it's a lot of fun, but I hadn't done that typically. Playing with role-players is hilarious though. So it doesn't matter what game you're playing, they'll take on some personality, they'll start to fill up. And it's funny, right? They're already they're here by the time you're still halfway through the rule book, right? That's, and I think that comes from some game playing experience. We had a great example. You guys mind me sharing that? Was that Peace for Odin you said? Yeah. So there's a certain tile in this game that was called the thing space. And it wasn't really explained very well in the rule. And we're like, what is thing space? Did they just not think of a name for it? And it turns out we were talking about thing is like Old Norse for something that means like gathering place. So it makes sense if you know that, but if you don't explain that, you don't know it. So they said, forget that. We're just going to call it the lynching tree, and that's going to be kind of this new aspect of the game. And I love that. That's going from that's even going against maybe what is in the progressive sort of rule book there, and making it your own, right? And that's memorable, right? The thing space is not memorable, but that is memorable. You guys remember that, right?
That's actually a kind of example of that is the homicide that I mentioned.
Yeah.
One of the zombie creatures that they had, the game design is called the fatty.
Yeah.
We banned that, as being basically not being inclusive at the table, and we call them floatings instead.
Right. I love it. That's awesome. Yeah. So I guess as a game designer, what I'm going to say is that some game designers are against this. They really want to keep everybody on the page. They want people to have the experience that they designed because it's their game. I'm going to encourage you. The main component of your game is the players, and open it up to allow people to have that. Actually create an environment that's conducive for people going from here to here, because this is where the real story happens. This is just sort of a framework for getting people started. Okay, thank you guys for sharing some great examples there of some of the tensions that happen. Okay. So finally get to it. Narrative versus mechanic. If you are designing, and I guess I'm going to have to wrap this up here quick because we're already in an hour, and Nick's going to get in here soon. If you were designing a game, at some point, your narrative and your mechanic part are going to clash.
I thought he was at 1.
Is he at 1? We got lots of time now. Okay, we got lots of time. That's good. Thanks for reminding me. If they kick us out, I guess they'll kick us out. So we'll keep going. You guys gonna keep going?
As long as you're okay with the eating.
Pardon me?
As long as you're okay with the eating.
Yeah, please do. That's great. So what do we do when these two things clash? And I put this up specifically because I had a playtest of Halls of Asgard one time. We'll talk a bit more about my game. It's a semi-cooperative game. There's a lot of sort of openness to role playing. There's a lot of social interaction, and I had 3 or 4 computer programmers play the game at one point in time, and they literally were sitting around the table with a pad of paper and calculators, and they were trying to calculate the percentage, probability of everybody using each pad. They were ripping their hair out. They're like, we can't get our heads around this game, and they didn't. They were looking for that progressive piece, right? They just wanted everything to be laid out. They wanted a really solid structure. They were looking for a numerical strategy that they could use to beat the other players. That wasn't what it was about. So that's the reason why I had the calculator guy up here. We also have the narrative, sort of a kind of Harry Potter sort of role player here too. Sometimes the narrative will take you in a direction that's just not feasible with mechanics, so it can't be represented well with mechanics. And what do you do then, right? You don't want to sacrifice the narrative. People get really invested in that. But sometimes as a designer, you kind of have to throw, kill your darlings, right? find a way to make your narrative and your mechanic jive. Now, this tension isn't bad. I think this tension is actually a really good thing. I think it's a thing that we can use to really sort of motivate players. Before we get into this, though, quick pod chat. I'd like you to rate yourself from 1 to 6. So it's not 1 is good, 6 is bad, anything like that. But I'd like you to rate yourselves in where you are. Are you, if you're 6, you are 100% into the narrative. That's the most important thing. Think like D&D, role-playing and stuff like that. If you're mechanics, you vote yourself as a 1. Chess is probably your favorite game. You love strategy games that take 8 hours for 3 turns, kind of things like that. Where would you rate yourself there? I'm gonna give you guys a minute there just to vote, and then we'll maybe share our own personal ratings as to where we fit in the scale. I intentionally did not include one right in the middle here. You're gonna have to choose a side, okay? Narrative or mechanics, and we'll go from there. Okay. You say 4 at the beginning, then you kind of roll the dice. Say we're looking at maybe 5. Narrative is super important. It's got to be mechanics, obviously, some sort of structure. But that's it. Kim, where would you rate yourself on the scale here?
It's terrible. I rejected your deck entirely.
And you rejected it entirely? Okay, so you guys are going to take the dice and smash it or not? Yeah.
Mostly because in RPGs, I personally think that a good RPG mechanics have to support the narrative. They go together.
Yeah.
So you can't have one without the other.
I agree, and my argument here is not that mechanics and narrative need to be at odds with each other, or that they are even dichotomous, but as a designer, you need to recognize that you have a bias towards one end or the other, and your games will probably reflect that. And you're going to need to take that in consideration when you run into the ones who come into your playtest with calculators and a pad of paper and start to dissect your games, or when you run into the 6s who come into your playtest and throw the rulebook out the window and are making up new rules and adding new features to the game. Right. So I would totally agree with you. This is not a dichotomous thing. This is not, you can't have mechanics and narrative. We're just kind of trying to place our personal biases. So if I frame it that way, where would you kind of fall? I know.
Okay, so when I interact with the game, the first thing I do is I interact with mechanics. So I get out of the calculator.
Right, that's the first step.
So that's like, I'm quite into that, but I'm always looking to see how it informs and leads to an interesting narrative.
Interesting, okay.
So I guess I'm 1, but then I leap to the 6.
So you gotta make your way through. You're gonna start here and you're gonna do it. Okay. That's what you said.
I would tend to do B3. I would say similarly. I look at the mechanics first. And how does it make an interesting game? How does it inform the narrative?
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, but if it does not get me into the narrative, then I'm going to drop the game.
Yeah, very cool. And that's interesting. You guys are seeing you kind of start in one place and you kind of end up somewhere else. So there's kind of maybe a preference to start with the mechanic, to start with structure, then start filling in the narrative. Cool. What do you guys say?
I'm a 5, but similarly, like I'll get sucked in by the narrative, but if the mechanics aren't engaging, like to drive a good game, then I just get pulled out.
I'm a 2 or a 3. I realize I like games that don't have narratives at all.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with that.
Yeah,
I still find it really fun, even though how this one play.
Yeah, that's right. Cool. That's great. Well, I'll share with you guys. I'm a solid 4. I'm definitely narrative is really important for me. If there's not a good story there, it's not going to flow. But and this discussion kind of came up a few times. If the narrative is there, but the mechanics are clunky, it gets in the way of the story for me, and that's just I have a hard time investing. So yeah, great. But once again, I think the reason this is important, not to kind of split us into 2 groups, but just to think, as a designer, what's your bias? You're probably going to design games that appeal to people on either end of the spectrum, more probably one than the other, and to compensate for that, the areas of focus you're going to want to focus on are probably kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. So, obviously with the game playing experience, you may have encountered lots of mechanics and lots of narratives, and some people have only played a few games. This could range. So we come back to this conversation. What do you do when your mechanics and your narratives start to collide and clash and are just not jiving together? Do you kind of just give a green card to one of them and say, okay, the mechanics always override, or the narratives always override? I think as much as possible, the work of designing games is actually to identify these points and then to kind of make them sort of kind of turn them and help them to kind of align so they support each other. That's the work of game design for me. You sit down and there's no clash between your narrative and mechanic. Either you're a genius or you didn't really do a lot to create a game. There's just not a lot there. So I think your point or your purpose as a game designer is actually to find these points where they clash, and your work is to start adjusting things and kind of screwing things back into place so that they align and they support each other. I'll talk about a few ways we were able to do that with Halls of Asgard through some of the different prototype playtests. And then if you guys are designing games, or if you want to talk about games you played, we can kind of go from there. So this is it. That's the work of designing games. People are our most kind of important asset of our games. People love stories. People also need structure to kind of enjoy being in a certain space. So this is what we're trying to do. Let me just give you a quick overview of Halls of Asgard. I'll use some of the terms and theories that we've talked about so far, now that we have that common language. And if you guys are free, I would love to run a playtest of Halls of Asgard up in the hall. If you guys would like to, you guys can try out the game, give me some feedback as a designer as well, and you can see where some of the things we developed came from. So, Halls of Asgard is a semi-cooperative game for 3 to 6 players. And the setting is this. It's kind of set in Viking mythology. In the Norse worldview, there's underworld, and there's a queen in the underworld named Hela. Okay? She's a super kind of creepy girl. She's kind of half dead and half alive. She's trying to destroy the homes of the gods. And the gods, if you're familiar with Marvel comics, you might know about like Odin and Thor and Loki. We have a few other characters from Norse mythology. They're trying to stop her. So the gods are working together to stop Hela. Same time, gods are gods, they have their personalities, and they also want to edge each other out. So if you're trying to collect more points than the other gods, you're also collectively trying to collect more points than Hela, so the Halls of Asgard are not destroyed. The game falls very squarely in Alea. There's a dice mechanic of randomness when you're trying to gain your points. We'll talk about how that happens. There's also a lot of mimicry. It lends itself well to having certain personalities, or kind of taking on the roles of the gods, feeling like you are kind of in this celestial battle with the Queen of the Underworld. And there are 2 sets of agents here. There are the gods, who are all the players, and there's Hela. And Hela is not actually a player character. She's a non-player character that is kind of enacted by whoever the first player of the round is. Those are our 2 agents. Pretty straightforward. And there's a few interactions. You can claim warriors through dice roll from kind of the human world, and that's how you collect your points. The points are warriors. You can use powers. Everybody has powers, and those are represented by small tokens. Flipping those over. And then there's this social sort of interaction with favors and grudges. So maybe somebody helps you out and fails to return the favor, and you've got a grudge against them. Or maybe somebody, for no particular reason, gets in your way of doing something, and now you may want to pay them back for that. Or you may kind of form some alliances, and groups start to form. That's also part of the game. So that's a basic breakdown of mechanics, and if you're designing a game, I really encourage you to sit down, figure out kind of what the main motivations of your game are, and make a list of agents and interactions. If on your list you have something that says dice, and it doesn't have an alternative term in your game, that's going to be challenging for you to know if people are getting to that emergent space, because if you just call it dice in the game, and they're calling it dice, that's what we call it. If people, instead of saying I'm rolling now, say I'm claiming now, that's a sign to me that they're starting to get into that kind of emergent space. If they are saying I'd like to have that token there, that's a signal to me that I haven't clearly communicated that those tokens are actually your powers. If they're saying I'm going to use my power now, they're hopping up into that emergent space where they're kind of taking on the role of the god. They're using the terminology that we created for the game, and they're seeing themselves as kind of part of that game. And then the favors and grudges is kind of part of the social aspect of it. So, in terms of the narrative, it is fairly straightforward. We have an artist from Europe. Her name is Helena Rosova, and she'll be doing the art for the game. This is not particularly from the game, but this is some of her art, so you get an idea of the style. Here's a picture of Hela, okay, Queen of the Underworld here. She's pairing up with a dragon. There's a dragon in Norse mythology called Nidhogg, and he kind of chews at the roots of the tree that fills the universe. And she's going to feed the dead warriors in her hall to this dragon, so the dragon can become more powerful and destroy the Halls of Asgard. Meanwhile, Odin, if you're familiar with the Norse myths, you'll know he's very wise. If you are not familiar with that, you kind of pick that up through the game, has discovered this plot. He brings the gods together, and he says, we have to stop Hela. And this is sort of the narrative of the story. And hearing people play the game and talk about, we got to stop Hela, and like, we got to work together, or you screwed me over last time. These sort of social interactions are kind of really fun to see as people sort of fill up the narrative themselves. As we play, I'll maybe share a few stories of different funny things that have happened, but that's those are our characters there. So I will give a few pieces so you can see some of the game tokens here. One of the most important features of the game are the heroes, and the heroes are these small MDF tokens. I'll let you guys take a look at those. These were cut for us by a local game designer named Todd McClellan. He's got a company called Clockwork Contraptions, and he did some really cool work. But these are a really important feature of the game. A few things. We used to have paper tokens when we were playtesting, and that was a huge impediment to people playing because they had a really hard time picking them up. And it was also hard to see if somebody had a stack of them, how many they had. Just by changing sort of the physical feel of these tokens, it's completely changed the game experience. People can now pick them up easily off the table. They feel great when they've got a big stack. They can see when somebody else has a stack, and so it's been really nice to have these. You guys will see there's some different numbers. What are the numbers you guys have on your tokens there? 0. Okay, 0. Oh.
I've got 1.
You got 1, and you got the 2 there. Perfect. Okay, so here's an example of a mechanic in the game. These are the points that you score. As you collect the warriors, you collect the points. And so we could have just called them a 0 warrior, a 1 warrior, and a 2 warrior. Instead, we did this. We said the zeros are cowards. Right? Every sort of culture and society is cowards. Right? They're not zeros, they're cowards. Okay? The 1s are the regular warriors, kind of your average Joes. The guys who are showing up in the shield wall with their axes, they're kind of doing their fighting thing. The 2s are the legendary heroes. Okay? They're kind of the clan leaders who kind of lead their people. And that's a great example, I think, of how we took something that was a really basic mechanic and then kind of gave it a little bit of life, or gave it a bit of zest by not just saying, okay, this is worth 0, 1, and 2 points. Essentially, that's what they are. We kind of work them into the narrative. And people have so much fun, especially with the coward thing. Oh, I don't want a coward. Like, oh, I gave you a coward. It's a funny thing. So that's fun. You guys will notice there's also different colors on there. So we have all the different colors. We've got blue, red, green, and black. Great. And so one of the challenges we had was our mechanic was simple, and I wanted to start simple and get more complicated if we need to. We found it was a little bit too simple. So at first, all the tokens were the same color, and it was simply whatever you collected is the points that you had. One of the guys on our design team said, what if there was some sort of like token collection system, if there were different kinds of tokens? And his first idea was, how about we have tokens that are spears, that are axes, that are shields, and that are swords? And those will be kind of the 4 different categories, and if people collect, 3 shields, there'll be this bonus, and if people collect 4 swords, there'll be this bonus. And we liked that idea. We played around with it. The challenge was, that was a neat mechanic that didn't really fit into the narrative. Why just having 3 swords, give you bonus points? Okay. I mean, from a mechanics point of view, great. Okay, you're collecting a set, that's fine. But from the narratives, we saw people kind of fighting with their warriors. It didn't make any sense. So then we shifted our focus, and we said, what if, instead of having 4 different weapons, we had 4 different clans? And there was even an idea put forward, maybe if we're talking about Vikings, there could be like the Icelanders, the Norwegians, the Swedes, and the Danes kind of thing. And then the idea was that if you collected 3 of the same type, there's 3 warriors from the same clan. And we know if you're fighting by yourself, it's kind of disparaging, maybe disheartening, but when you're fighting with your clan members, you'll fight better. And so we worked it into our mechanic then that when you collect 3 from the same clan, no matter what their initial value is, they're all worth an additional 1. Because in the final battle, they're going to fight better. So a 0, even if they're a coward, if they're with kind of their friends and their family and their clan, they might fight more like a regular warrior. And a regular warrior might step up if they're kind of defending their clan and their family members to fight maybe 1 better. And I think that's a really, really specific and clear example of how we took something that was a really basic mechanic, 0, 1, 2, enhanced it with sort of a token collection system, but then we were able to overlay it with a narrative that kind of engages people and makes sense with the story. Hopefully doesn't come off as sort of like hackneyed or sort of forced, but kind of fits naturally into people's idea of kind of what's going on and how they're fighting. So that's an idea of how we kind of took a narrative and a mechanic sort of interaction that didn't seem to be working well and kind of readjusted them to align and work together. The first version of the game has a life stage board. These warriors pass through different life stages. I only have 1 copy right here, so I'll just kind of bring it around. This is our current prototype version. They are kind of born into the world as children. They age to warriors as the rounds go on. They then age to elders. If they die as elders in the Viking mythology, if you die of old age, you don't get to go to Valhalla and feast with the gods, so they would go down to Hela. And Hela collects all those points of the elders that pass through the board. If the gods can claim them before they die of old age, though, they get to bring them into their own halls, and that's how they score their points. So when I first put this together, my wife and I were playing the prototype. We didn't have those fancy tokens. We had pennies because she was collecting a lot of old pennies. And we'll have a chance to play this if you guys are free to try to play test afterwards. And my original board had actually 6 life stages on it. Okay, there was a child, there was a youth, there was a warrior, there was a jarl, there was an elder, and then there was this stage called the barrows, which was kind of like right after you died. Odin had a chance to kind of swoop in and grab the soul right before it went to Hela. And I thought this was great. I'm a huge Viking nerd, and I thought, wow, this is going to be so engaging. And when we started playing the games, we found that with 3 to 6 players, they never made it past the warrior stage. And so all of the jarls and the elders and these barrel mechanics that had set up and spent so much time sort of carefully crafting were just never even being touched because we weren't making it there. That was a hard decision, maybe not for the design team as a whole, but for me to make because I was really invested in that idea that they kind of pass through the stages and there's different effects and powers with different stages, but I had to let that one go. And I got to be honest with you, I think it's really enhanced the game by condensing the youth and the child stage into just a top child stage, the jarl and warrior stage into just a warrior, and the bear and elder stage into just an elder. The game mechanically works a lot better and actually gives a little bit more freedom for people to fill in their own stories. And so once again, there was a situation there where the mechanics and the narrative, there was a great narrative piece that I thought had a lot of power. The mechanics were just telling me it wasn't working, and we were able to adjust the narrative, adjust the mechanics to make those work together. We didn't just toss one out and say, well, the life stages aren't working with the mechanics, so forget the life stages. We also didn't say, the life stages aren't working with the mechanic, forget the mechanic, forget player experience, we're just going to do it anyways because that's the kind of game we want to make. It really worked to align those two things. There's an example kind of from both sides. In terms of our time, we've got about 40 minutes left. If you guys are up for playing a game, it typically takes 20 to 30 minutes. We may have a chance to do that. Before that, though, I'll maybe just open it up to questions, either about the game or about anything we talked about today. Well, if you guys are free to do a play test, we can talk more about the game, or if you have other questions, we can talk about that. But I think we're going to wrap that up here, and maybe move it. I'm going to move over to the hall. Thank you so much to Aaron for recording this for us, and thank you guys for being here. I know it was a small crowd, but I really appreciated actually being able to chat with everybody and hear some of your stories and get some feedback. If there's anything in the talk that you found really interesting, I'd love to hear about that. If you have any things that you think I missed or maybe that didn't quite make sense, I'd love to hear about that as well. We've got a Facebook page that we post everything up on. Right now, our big focus is we're working on a live action trailer for the game. We're hoping to release in the fall, and so it's been fun, sort of like casting the gods, Loki and Thor, and those sorts of things. So keep an eye out for that. And we also have a website at littlehammergames.ca. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you guys so much. Oh, thanks. Cool. So like I said, I'm going to move this over to the hall there. If you'd like to join us for a playtest, that's great. If you have other things going on, that's fine too. Thank you so much.